On July 25th, 1729, North Carolina officially became a crown colony, which is just one step in the history of what would eventually become a U.S. state, but one that raised a particular bone of contention: the border with its southern neighbor, South Carolina, issues that would not be fully resolved for another 3 centuries. In fact, North Carolina has faced disputes and at times conflict over all of its borders, even the one to the east. The disputed borders of the Old North State are history that deserves to be remembered. Native populations have been in the area that is now the U.S. state of North Carolina for some 10,000 years, and Europeans have been creating settlements there at least since the 16th century. But the creation of the Proprietary colony in 1663 can be seen as the beginning of the entity that would eventually become a U.S. state. The Proprietary colony was really created as a result of the English Civil War, or rather, the end of that war. The South Carolina Historical Society writes, King Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch. After years of exile during Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Commonwealth, Charles was restored to the throne in 1660. He looked for ways to reward the men who supported his restoration, and a grant of land in North America seemed appropriate. The charter that made these men and their heirs and assigns the true and absolute Lord Proprietors of Carolina was signed on March 24th, 1663. The name Carolina is a derivation of the Latin word for Charles, Carolus, which appears prominently on Charles II's Great Seal. Notably, not a single one of the 8 lords to whom the king gave the responsibility of populating and governing the new colony ever actually set foot in said colony. This represented the beginning of North Carolina's territorial disputes. William K. Boyd, a professor of history at Duke University, explained in 1929, the boundary had long been a source of irritation to the governments of North Carolina and Virginia. Its origin is found in the terms of the Carolina Charters. That of 1663 declared the northern boundary of the colony to be 36 degrees, but by the second charter the boundary was declared to run from the north end of the Currituck River or inlet upon a strait westerly to the Wyandotte Creek, which lies within about the degree of 36 degrees and 30 minutes northern latitude, and as far west of the direct line and as far south seas. Thus a strip of land approximately 30 miles wide was added to Carolina. Living therein were people holding land grants for Virginia. In fact, the region included all of the Albemarle section of Carolina. Until the boundary was officially established in accordance with the provisions of the Second Charter, a conflict of jurisdiction between North Carolina and Virginia was inevitable. That conflict began in 1680, when certain people on the borderlands refused any longer to pay the Virginia quit rents, although their titles were from the Virginia Land Office. Thereupon the sheriff of Lower Norfolk County was ordered by the Virginia Council to collect the rents. In response, the Lords Proprietors of Carolina asked the Crown to instruct Virginia to appoint a commission to work with North Carolina to establish the boundary between the colonies. But, Boyd writes, to this petition, no reply is extant. In 1688, the reverse happened, when Boyd writes the people around Currituck Inlet complained to the Virginia authorities that North Carolina officials were distraining on their property for taxes. This time it was Virginia who complained to the Crown, but again, there is no record of any action by the British authorities, and conflicts over jurisdiction continued. In 1699, the King's government ordered the governor of North Carolina to create a commission to resolve the boundary dispute, but Virginia refused to recognize the commissioners appointed by the North Carolina governor, Thomas Harvey, claiming that he was not legitimate because he had been appointed by the proprietors and not the king. Boyd theorizes the real motive behind the Virginia policy was perhaps a hope that the Crown might purchase Carolina and so restore the territory that had been lost. Such a policy was recommended to the Lords of Trade by Governor Nicholson in 1701. By 1705, Virginia and North Carolina began their own competing surveys. In 1709, the issue was taken up by the Lords of Trade and Plantations, a committee of the Privy Council responsible for advising on colonial affairs and trade for the English Crown. The Lords recommended a joint survey. Both colonies appointed commissioners, and a survey began in 1710. Boyd writes, but the results were unsatisfactory. This was due to the obstructionary tactics of the North Carolina commissioners. It was hard for the Virginia commissioners to arrange a meeting with them. They quibbled over the official instructions, sought to confuse old residents of the territory in question who were called upon to make depositions, found fault with the readings of the instruments of the Virginia commissioners, and so prevented any definite conclusion of the survey. The issue had to do with Wyandotte Creek, which by the 1663 charter was the point from which the boundary was to extend westward. But by 1710, the creek had lost its original name, and consequently there was difficulty in locating it. The disagreement over which creek was the correct creek not only affected a significant amount of land, but also the ability of North Carolina tobacco producers to move their crop to market without paying export duties to Virginia. An agreement between the respective governors and the Lords of Trade didn't come until 1728, when a joint survey could finally be conducted, 65 years after the colony of Carolina had first been chartered, creating the dispute. But that was not the only boundary in dispute. The proprietors quickly came to the conclusion that Carolina was too big to govern as a single entity. NCpedia, a website managed by the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library, explains the proprietors had recognized that one governor and one assembly couldn't manage a colony as big as Carolina, not when the settlements in Albemarle, Cape Fear, and Charlestown were so far apart, and transportation up and down the coast was so difficult. In 1691, the proprietors appointed a governor for all of Carolina and a deputy governor for its northern half, and this arrangement provided better administration. In 1712, North and South Carolina were officially divided. The issue was more than geography, as the North Carolina History Project explains. Such a division was deemed necessary because Carolina had earned a reputation for being a colony with an often unruly population. For some time, there had been unruly behavior and political disagreement in what would become North Carolina. While the difference meant different governors appointed by the proprietors, the now two Carolinas were still a proprietary colony, both nominally ruled by the same 8 proprietors. As the northern part had been settled first and thus was older, North Carolina would eventually be given the nickname the Old North State, which is still today the title of the state song and the state toast. And notably, despite separating the two Carolinas, no real effort was made to define the border between them. That is, North Carolina had no clear definition of either its northern or its southern border. The proprietary colony struggled for many reasons. According to NCpedia, the story of Carolina's first 50 years is one of turmoil, political conflict, corrupt officials, unpaid taxes, incompetent proprietors, open rebellion, conflict with the natives, and rapacious pirates. This displeased the Crown, who was under the impression that the Lords Proprietors should be doing things like maintaining order and, of course, levying taxes. In 1719, South Carolina petitioned the king, George I, to make Carolina a royal colony, that is, to be ruled directly by the crown rather than by the proprietors, and the king assented. At the time, South Carolina was larger and more prosperous, but North Carolina, even though the border between the two was still not clearly defined, remained the property of the proprietors. But, NCpedia writes, in 1729, 7 of the 8 Lords Proprietors agreed to sell their shares of North Carolina to King George II, and North Carolina, too, became a royal colony. The one holdout, the Earl Granville, was allowed to retain his property, 1/8 of the colony, but had no say in governance. North Carolina became a crown colony on July 25, 1729. Incidentally, being a crown colony brought stability and economic development, and it was during that period that North Carolina became a leader in the production of important naval stores such as tar, pitch, rosin, and turpentine, culled from the state's extensive pine forests. This would, although there's dispute exactly when, be the genesis of the state's other nickname, the Tar Heel State. The same year that North Carolina became a crown colony, the long-delayed joint survey finally started that would settle the border with Virginia. That survey would not be fully completed until 1799, but problems would continue to arise. First, the line was marked only on trees, and in time the border markers were lost. Later surveys showed that the surveys were off by some degrees. The necessary relocations were completed until surveys in 1887 and 1896. Thus, the border between North Carolina and Virginia was not fully surveyed and marked until 233 years after the creation of Carolina had initiated the need for a boundary. The establishment of the Crown Colony, however, would mark the beginning of a border dispute in the South. NCpedia writes, the series of boundary disputes with South Carolina was long and bitter. Historian Dr. Robert B. Temple explained in the 2011 edition of the South Carolina Historical Society journal Carolog that the 35-degree line of latitude made a logical division, since it could separate Carolina into roughly equal halves. Thus, King George made that the basis for division. But that quickly offered problems, as North Carolina had already made land grants south of the Cape Fear River, prompting the king to shift the line south in that area. The result was still poorly defined border, which presented more and more problems as the territory gained population. The colonial governments worked with the Lords of Trade to find compromises, but Temple writes officials continued to quibble. And the uncertain boundary was causing increasing problems with matters such as law enforcement and tax collection. With jurisdiction unclear, conflicting land claims inevitably led to disorders, riots, and bloodshed. A joint survey finally began after a compromise in 1730, but Encyclopedia writes George Burrington, governor of North Carolina, later refused to allow funding for the survey, claiming that it would be a wasteful expense and that the PD River would be a better dividing line. His dithering, however, served his colony, as Encyclopedia explains. Had Burrington allowed that survey, North Carolina would have lost nearly all of the country west of the Cape Fear River and much of the present area of the state. A new governor led to a new agreement and new surveys in 1735 and 1737, following the rule that the line was to run diagonally northwest from a cedar stake driven into the Atlantic shore to the 35th parallel, then straight west to the South Seas, meaning the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, the surveyors didn't quite make it to the Pacific Ocean. In fact, they didn't make it quite to the 35th parallel, Temple explains. For reasons unknown, they stopped 11 miles short of the 35th parallel. It may have been simple error, but the issue also may have been the difficult conditions, and the commissioners complained low pay. But Temple writes, for whatever reason, the line ended at 34 degrees 49 minutes, a critically important event that shaped the outline of the future states. Problems began to appear as the population extended past the end of the 1737 survey. Encyclopedia writes, by the 1750s, both provinces had issued grants to some of the same properties. Government authority in the disputed areas broke down as officials of one colony were arrested or driven away by authorities or residents of the other as they tried to perform their duties. Governor Arthur Dobbs later bitterly denounced South Carolina's sheriffs and tax collectors in the disputed area as an invasive force. Clearly, the survey needed to be extended, but when it finally was, in 1764, North Carolina surveyor James Cook continued west from the point where the survey ended in 1737, rather than moving up to the 35th parallel. Thus, the new survey had the border too far south, costing South Carolina more than 600 square miles of territory. This would then result in a strange bend in the border between the states. As Temple explains, the Lords of Trade realized that Cook's 1764 survey line fell too far south of the 35th parallel and insisted on compensation for South Carolina. They decided to make up the lost area by placing the rest of the boundary north of 35 degrees, which became the basis for the next surveying expedition. A strange bulge was also created as surveyors skirted the edge of land given by the king by treaty to the Catawba Nation. A new survey was conducted in 1772. It was full of errors. Conducted by William Moultrie, who would become famous later as a general during the War for Independence, Temple writes, Moultrie may have been an outstanding general, but he was a poor surveyor. His lines drifted north, a mistake which gave South Carolina an extra 160 square miles past the 300 already granted to make up for the error in 1764. The survey was not completed all the way west until 1815. Ironically, Temple explains, ultimately, not a single mile of the tortuous boundary had followed the prescribed 35th parallel. This uneven border meant that issues continued to arise, and it became a problem 175 years after the last survey was completed in 1815, as by the 1990s, issues arose regarding the state boundary between York County, South Carolina, and Gaston County, North Carolina. Carolina's Hutchins law firm explains, the natural monuments which marked our respective territories have shifted or disappeared over the years. So those who staked their claims along those boundaries and thought that they were in one state or the other have left their heirs and assignees scratching their heads these many years later. Thus, in 1993, 281 years after North and South Carolina were separated, the two states agreed to another survey of their common border using modern technology. The survey was completed May 3, 2013, and the resulting boundary changes became effective January 1, 2017. The dispute had spanned more than 3 centuries. The changes offer some difficulty for a few homeowners, as Eyewitness 7 News explains. Some families will find their homes moved to the other side of the new border entirely, but others aren't as lucky. One woman will have the new state line go right through her master bedroom. The homes that will become split by the new border will now have to pay property taxes to both states. Another family will see their health insurance change with the move from South Carolina to North Carolina. But new issues are arising as the population moved west. Georgia had only been created as a colony in 1732, making it much younger than the other British colonies in North America. It has a long border with South Carolina, with a long history of border disputes between the two. But its border with North Carolina is relatively short, but would lead to a violent border clash over a strange strip of land. The Rabun County, Georgia Historical Society explains. This controversy erupted over a poorly defined 12-mile wide piece of land north of the 35th parallel, which was the recognized border between Georgia and North Carolina. Originally claimed by South Carolina, the state ceded it to the federal government in 1787. The government then gave it to the Cherokee in 1798. And the Cherokee ceded the land back to the U.S. government. Between 1798 and 1802, the Strip was open to public domain, meaning the territory was under no sovereign state authority. The resulting lack of authority did not, of course, attract the best crowd. The Historical Association writes, since the area was lawless and violent, largely populated by criminals and renegade Cherokee, the surrounding states of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were hesitant to claim the area. This small strip of land, not wanted by anyone, it seemed, therefore became known as the Orphan Strip. By 1800, residents wanted some state protection, and they appealed to South Carolina to take control. But South Carolina said no. North Carolina stepped in and adopted the Orphan Strip, making it part of what was then Buncombe County. But in 1802, Congress made an agreement with Georgia called the Compact of 1802. The central issue of the compact was Georgia ceding land in the West that would become the states of Mississippi and Alabama. But a provision gave the Orphan Strip to Georgia. But the land had already been taken over by North Carolina. Georgia created a Walton County to cover the Strip. This led to conflict between residents who had held land grants from Georgia and from North Carolina, and between officials of Walton and Buncombe County. These confrontations were often violent. On December 14, 1804, Buncombe County Constable John Havner was struck over the head by a Walton County supporter with a musket, killing him. The war had started. As a result of the death of a county official, Buncombe County called out their militia. Here the story gets murky. University of North Carolina librarian Harry McCown writes, stories of the Walton War grew over the years, creating a legend of the conflict in which truth and fiction freely mixed. In the legend, dozens of Georgians died in pitched battles with North Carolina militia. The frustrated farmers of Walton County, worried about the legality of their land grants, became, in some stories, bands of vicious desperados inhabiting a no-man's land beyond the law. In fact, the only confirmed casualty of the war was Havner, and it's doubtful that any Georgia militia was involved, as the Strip was far from Georgia's main cities. Rather, some 70 North Carolina militia arrested 10 Walton County officials, planning to try them for the murder of Havner. All 10 escaped before trial, but the government of Walton County effectively collapsed, ending the Walton War. A joint commission in 1807 determined that the Strip was north of the 35th parallel and thus in North Carolina. Georgia at first refused to accept the finding, but when a further survey in 1811 came to the same conclusion, Georgia finally surrendered its claim. The Strip is now part of North Carolina's Transylvania County. Georgia created a new Walton County, east of Atlanta, in 1818. North Carolina also borders Tennessee to the west, and how Tennessee came to be will likely warrant its own episode sometime, but the rough border between the two states was difficult to survey. This led to confusion over a piece of land between the Tellico River and Slick Rock Creek basins. Historian Luke Mangett wrote on his website, The Southern Highlander, the border was last officially surveyed in 1821, but both states had lost their original copies of the survey. North Carolina's burned in a fire, and Tennesseans seem to have simply misplaced theirs. For some 70 years, the location of the border was not an issue, but Tennessee began issuing patents to the disputed land in the 1880s, spawning numerous lawsuits and dispossessions. This had not been an issue, as the area was lightly populated. Mangett writes, the location of the border drew the attention of the states in the 1890s because the virgin timber on the disputed land had suddenly become valuable. Following the completion of the Western North Carolina Railroad in 1891 and the promises of rail linkages to national and global markets, covetous eyes turned towards the finest timberlands to be found anywhere in this part of the country. Thus, the formerly ignored land suddenly became valuable to land speculators. The dispute almost turned violent. In April of 1899, a posse, including a deputy U.S. Marshal and the sheriff of Monroe County, Tennessee, arrested a landowner in the disputed area, charging him with trespassing. North Carolina responded by sending a posse that then arrested the posse from Tennessee. Their fate became embroiled with other court battles over people with competing land grants from Tennessee and North Carolina. But war never erupted. Instead, the argument was taken to the courts, reaching all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mangett explains, in 1911, the Tennessee State Archivist discovered copies of the original 1821 map in a moldy basement in Nashville, And the next year, a grandson of the original surveyor found his grandfather's diary with the expedition in an old desk. And based on this new evidence, the Supreme Court finally sided with the North Carolinians in 1914, some 22 years after the initial litigation. North Carolina borders Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina. And ever since it split from South Carolina in 1663, it has had ongoing border disputes with all of the above, continuing even into the 21st century. But you would think that their eastern border, which is of course the Atlantic Ocean, at least would be safe. And you'd be wrong. Based on their original charter, North Carolina claims that their territorial waters extend 3 geographic miles past the extreme low water mark. But this can come in conflict with federal law, such as the Outer Continental Shelf Land Act, which governs mineral resources on the Outer Continental Shelf. And so North Carolina is currently embroiled in a legal dispute with the federal government over the federal government doing seismic exploration for oil and gas. An issue that will become much more salient if there's a move to lift the current moratorium on oil and gas drilling off of the Carolinas. So it seems that on all sides, North Carolina has had difficulty with its borders. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.